Section 14 of the Riddle and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sabrina Warren. The Riddle and Other Stories by Walter de la Mare. The Creatures. It was the ebbing light of evening that recalled me out of my story to a consciousness of my whereabouts. I dropped the squat little red book to my knee and glanced out the narrow and begrimed oblong window. We were skirting the eastern coast of cliffs, to the very edge of which a ploughman, stumbling along behind his two great horses, was driving the last of his dark furrows. In a cleft far down between the rocks a cold and idle sea was soundlessly laying its frigid garlands of foam. I stared over the flat stretch of waters, then turned my head and looked with a kind of suddenness into the face of my one fellow traveler. He had entered the carriage all but unheeded, yet not altogether unresented, at the last country station. His features were a little obscure in the fading daylight that hung between our four narrow walls, but apparently his eyes had been fixed on my face for some little time. He narrowed his lids at this unexpected confrontation, jerked back his head, and cast a glance out of his murky glass at the slip of greenish bright moon that was struggling into its full brilliance above the dun, swelling uplands. "It's a queer experience, railway traveling," he began abruptly, in a low, almost deprecating voice, drawing his hand across his eyes. "One is cast into a passing privacy with a fellow stranger, and then is gone." It was as if he had been patiently awaiting the attention of a chosen listener. I nodded, looking at him. "That privacy, too," he ejaculated. "All that!" My eyes turned towards the window again, bare, thorned, black, January hedge, inhospitable salt coast, flat waste of northern water. Our engine-driver promptly shut off his steam, and we slid almost noiselessly out of sight of sky and sea into a cutting. "It's a desolate country," I ventured to remark. "Oh, yes, desolate," he echoed a little wearily. "But what frets me is the way we have in arrogating to ourselves the offices of judge, jury, and counsel all in one. As if this earth, I never forget it, the futility, the presumption, it leads nowhere. We drive into all this silence, this forsakenness, this dream of a world between her lights of day and nighttime. We desecrate consciousness. What restless monkeys men are!" He recovered himself, swallowing his indignation with an obvious gulp. "As if," he continued in more chastened tones, "as if that other gate were not forever ajar into God knows what of peace and mystery." He stooped forward, lean, darkened, objurgatory. "Don't we make our world? Isn't that our blessed, our betrayed responsibility?" I nodded and ensconced myself, like a dog in straw, in the basest of all responses to a rare, even if eccentric, candor, caution. "Well," he continued a little weariedly, "that's the indictment. Small wonder if it will need a trumpet to blare us into that last family prayers. Then perhaps a few solitaries, just a few, will creep out of their holes and fastnesses, and draw mercy from the merciful on the cities of the plain. The buried talent will shine none the worse for the long, long looming of its napery spun from dream and desire." Years ago, 10, 15 perhaps, I chanced on the queerest specimen of this order of the talented. Much the same country, too. This, he swept his glance out towards the now invisible sea, this is a kind of dwarf replica of it, more naked, smoother, more sudden and precipitous, more forsaken, moody. Alone! The trees shorn there, as if with monstrous shears by the winter gales, the air's salt. It is a country of stones and emerald meadows, of green, meandering, aimless lanes, of farms set in their cliffs and valleys like rough time-bedimed jewels, as if by some angel of humanity, wandering between dark and daybreak. I was younger then, in body. The youth of the mind is for men of a certain age. Yours, maybe, and mine. Even then, even at that, I was sickened of crowds, of that unimaginable London, swarming wilderness of mankind, in which a poor lost thirsty dog from otherwhere tastes the full meaning of that idle word, forsaken. Forsaken by whom, is the question I ask myself now. Visitors to my particular paradise were few then, as if, my dear sir, we are not all of us visitors, visitants, revenants, on earth, panting for time in which to tell and share our secrets, roving in search of the marks that shall prove our quest not vain, not unprecedented, not a treachery, but let that be. I would start off morning after morning, bread and cheese in pocket, from the bare old house I lodged in, bound for that unforeseen nowhere for which the heart, the fantasy, aches. Lingering hot noondays would find me stretched in a state of half comatose, yet vigilant, on the close-flowered turf of the fields or cliffs, on the sun-baked sands and rocks, soaking in the scene and life around me like some kind of pilgrim chameleon. It was in hope to lose my way that I would set out. How shall a man find his way unless he lose it? Now and then I succeeded. That country is large, and its land and sea marks easily cheat the stranger. I was still of an age, you see, when my small door was ajar, and I planted a solid foot to keep it from shutting. But how could I know what I was after? One just shakes the tree of life, and the rare fruits come tumbling down, to rot for the most part in the lush grasses. What was most haunting and provocative in that far-away country was its fleeting resemblance to the country of dream. You stand, you sit, or lie prone on its bud-starred heights, and look down. The green, dispersed, treeless landscape spreads beneath you, with its hollows and mounded slopes, clustering farmstead and scatter of village, all motionless under the vast wash of sun and blue, like the drop scene of some enchanted playhouse centuries old. So, too, the visionary bird-haunted headlands, veiled faintly in a mist of unreality above their broken stones in the enormous saucer of the sea. You cannot guess what you may not chance upon, or whom. Bells clash, boom, and quarrel hollowly on the edge of darkness in those breakers. Voices waver across the fainter winds. The birds cry in a tongue unknown yet not unfamiliar. The sky is the hawks and the stars. There is one on the edge of life, of the unforeseen, whereas our cities are not our desiccated, jaded minds, ever continually pressing and edging further and further away from freedom, the vast unknown, the infinite presence, picking a fool's journey from sensual fact to fact, at the tail of that he-ass called reason? I suggest that in that solitude the spirit within us realizes that it treads the outskirts of a region long since called the imagination. I assert we have strayed, and on our blindness abandoned— My stranger paused in his frenzy, glanced out at me from his obscure corner as if he had intended to stun, to astonish me with some violent hearsay. We puffed out slowly, laboriously, from a halt, at which, in the gathering dark and moonshine, we had for some while been at a standstill. Never was wedding guest more desperately at the mercy of ancient mariner. Well, one day, he went on, lifting his voice a little to master the resounding heart-beats of our steam engine, one late afternoon, in my goalless wanderings, I had climbed to the summit of a steep grass-grown cart track, winding up dustily between dense, untended hedges. Even then I might have missed the house to which it led, for, hairpin fashion, the track here abruptly turned back on itself, and only a far fainter footpath led on over the hill crest. I might, I say, have missed the house and its inmates, if I had not heard the musical sound of what seemed like the twangling of a harp. This thin-drawn, sweet, tuneless warbling welled over the close-green grass of the height, as if out of space. Truth cannot say whether it was that of air or of my own fantasy. Nor did I ever discover what instrument, whether of man or aerial, had released a strain so pure and yet so bodiless. I pushed on and found myself in command of a gorse-strewn height, a stretch of country that lay a few hundred paces across the steep and sudden valley in between. A V-shaped entry to the left and sunwards lay an azure and lazy tongue of the sea, and as my eyes slid softly thence and upward and along the sharp green horizon line against the glass-clear turquoise of space, it caught the flinty glitter of a square chimney. I pushed on, and presently found myself at the gate of a farmyard. There was but one straw mow upon its staddles. A few fowls were sunning themselves in their dust baths. White and pied doves preened and cooed on the roof of an outbuilding, as golden with its lichens as if the western sun had scattered its dust for centuries upon the large slate slabs. Just that life and the whispering of the wind, nothing more. Yet even at one swift glimpse I seemed to have trespassed upon a peace that had endured for ages, to have crossed the viewless border that divides time from eternity. I leaned, resting, over the gate, and could have remained there for hours, lapsing ever more profoundly into the blessed quietude that had stolen over my thoughts. a bent-up woman appeared at the dark entry of a stone shed opposite to me, and, shading her eyes, paused in prolonged scrutiny of the stranger. At that I entered the gate and, explaining that I had lost my way and was tired and thirsty, asked for some milk. She made no reply, but after peering up at me, with something between suspicion and apprehension on her weather-beaten old face, led me toward the house which lay to the left on the slope of the valley, hidden from me till then by plumy bushes of tamarisk. It was a low grave house, grey-chimneyed, its stone walls traversed by a deep shadow cast by the declining sun, its dark windows rounded and uncurtained, its door wide open to the porch. She entered the house, and I paused upon the threshold. A deep, unmoving quiet lay within, like that of water in a cave renewed by the tide. Above a table hung a wreath of wild flowers. To the right was a heavy oak settle upon the flags. A beam of sunlight pierced the air of the staircase from an upper window. Presently a dark, long-faced, gaunt man appeared from within, contemplating me, as he advanced, out of eyes that seemed not so much to fix the intruder as to encircle his image, as the sea contains the distant speck of a ship on its wide blue bosom of water. They might have been the eyes of the blind, the windows of a house in dream to which the inmate must make something of a pilgrimage to look out upon actuality. Then he smiled, and the long, dark features, melancholy yet serene, took light upon them, as might a bluff of rock beneath a thin passing wash of sunshine. With a gesture he welcomed me into the large, dark-flagged kitchen, cool as a cellar, airy as a belfry, its sweet air traversed by a long oblong of light out of the west. The wide shelves of the painted dresser were laden with crockery. A wreath of freshly gathered flowers hung over the chimney-piece. As we entered, a twittering cloud of small birds, robins, hedge-sparrows, chaffinches, fluttered up a few inches from floor and sill and window-seat, and once more, with tiny, starry-dark eyes observing me, soundlessly alighted. I could hear the infinitesimal tick-tack of their tiny claws upon the slate. My gaze drifted out of the window into the garden beyond, a cavern of clearer crystal and color than that which astounded the eyes of young Aladdin. Apart from the twisting garland of wild flowers, the shining metal of range and copper candlestick, and the bright scoured crockery, there was no adornment in the room except a rough frame, hanging from a nail in the wall, and enclosing what appeared to be a faint patterned fragment of blue silk or fine linen. The chairs and table were old and heavy, a low light warbling, an occasional skirr of a wing, a haze-like drone of bee and fly. These were the only sounds that edged a quiet, intensified in its profundity by the remote stirrings of the sea. The house was stilled as by a charm, yet thought within me asked no questions. Speculation was asleep in its kennel. I sat down to the milk and bread, the honey and fruit which the old woman laid upon the table, and her master seated himself opposite to me, now in a low sibilant whisper, a tongue which they seemed to understand, addressing himself to the birds, and now, as if with an effort, raising those strange grey-green eyes of his to bestow a quiet remark upon me. He asked, rather in courtesy than with any active interest, a few questions, referring to the world, its business and transports, our beautiful world, as an astronomer in the small hours might murmur a few words to the chance-set guest of his solitude concerning the secrets of Uranus or Saturn. There is another, an inexplorable side to the moon. Yet he said enough for me to gather that he, too, was of that small tribe of the aloof and wild to which our cracked old word forsaken might be applied, hermits, lamas, clay-matted fakirs, and the such-like, the snowy birds that play and cry amid mid-oceanic surges, the living of an oasis of the wilderness, which share a reality only distantly dreamed of by the time-driven, thought-corroded congregations of man. Yet so narrow and hazardous I somehow realized was the brink of a fellow being, shall I call it, which we shared, he and I, that again and again fantasy within me seemed to hover over that precipice night knows as fear. It was he, it seemed, with that still, embracive contemplation of his, with that far-away yet reassuring smile, that kept my poise, my balance. "No," some voice within him seemed to utter, "you are safe. The bounds are fixed. Though hallucination chaunt its decoy, you shall not irretrievably pass over. Eat and drink, and presently return to life. And I listened, and, like that of a drowsy child in its cradle, my consciousness sank deeper and deeper, stilled, pacified, into the dream amid which, as it seemed, this soundless house of stone now reared its walls. I had all but finished my meal when I heard footsteps approaching on the flags without. The murmur of other voices, distinguishably shrill, yet guttural even at a distance, and in spite of the dense stones and beams of the house which had blunted their timber, had already reached me. Now the feet halted. I turned my head, cautiously, even perhaps apprehensively, and confronted two figures in the doorway. I cannot now guess the age of my entertainer. These children, for children they were in face and gesture and effect, though as to form and stature were apparently in their late teens. These children were far more problematical. I say form and stature, yet obviously they were dwarfish. Their heads were sunken between their shoulders, their hair thick, their eyes disconcertingly deep-set. They were ungainly, their features peculiarly irregular, as if two races from the ends of the earth had in them intermingled their blood and strangeness, as if, rather, animal and angel had connived in their creation. But if some inward light lay on the still eyes, on the gaunt, sorrowful, quixotic countenance that was now fully and intensely bent on mine, and pathetically that light was theirs also. He spoke to them. They answered. In English, my own language, without a doubt, but in English slurred, broken, and unintelligible to me, yet clear as a bell, haunting, penetrating, pining as voice of Nyx or siren. My ears drank in the sound as an Arab parched with desert sand falls on his dried belly and gulps in mouthfuls of crystal water. The birds hopped nearer, as if beneath the rod of an enchanter. A sweet, continuous clamor arose from their small throats. The exquisite colors of plume and bosom burned, greened, melted in the level sun-ray, in the darker air beyond. A kind of mournful gaiety, a lamentable felicity, such as rings in the cadences of an old folk song, welled into my heart. I was come back to the borders of Eden, bowed and outwearied, gazing from out of dream into dream, homesick, forsaken. Well, years have gone by, muttered my fellow traveler deprecatingly, but I have not forgotten that Eon's primeval trees and shade. They led me out, these bizarre companions, a he and a she, if I may put it as crudely as my apprehension of them put it to me then. Through a broad door they conducted me, if one who leads may be said to be conducted, into their garden. Garden! A full mile long, between undiscerned walls, it sloped and narrowed towards a sea at whose dark, unfoamed blue, even at this distance, my eyes dazzled. Yet how can one call that a garden which reveals no ghost of a sign of human arrangement, of human slavery, of spade or hoe? Great boulders shouldered up, tessellated, embossed, powdered with 1,000 various mosses and lichens, between a flowering greenery of weeds. Wind-stunted, clear emerald, lichen-tufted trees smoothed and crisped the inflowing airs of the ocean with their leaves and spines, sibilating a thin, scarce-audible music. Scanty, rank, and uncultivated fruits hung close their vivid-colored cheeks to the gnarled branches. It was the harborage of birds, the small, embowering parlor of their house of life, under an evening sky, pure and lustrous as a water-drop. It cried, "Hospital," to the wanderers of the universe. As I look back in ever-thinning nebulous remembrance on my two companions, hear their voices gutturally sweet and shrill, catch again their being, so to speak, I realize that there was a kind of orientalism in their effect. Their instant courtesy was not Western. The smiles that greeted me whenever I turned my head to look back at them were infinitely friendly, yet infinitely remote. So ungainly, so far from our notions of beauty and symmetry were their bodies and faces, those heads thrust heavily between their shoulders, their disproportionate yet graceful arms and hands, that the children in some of our English villages might be moved to stone them, while their elders looked on and laughed. Dusk was drawing near. Soon night would come, the colors of the sunset, sucking its extremest dye from every leaf and blade and petal, touched my consciousness even then with a vague fleeting alarm. I remember I asked these strange and happy beings, repeating my question twice or thrice, as we neared the surfy entry of the valley upon whose sands a tiny stream emptied its fresh waters. I asked them if it was they who had planted this multitude of flowers, many of a kind utterly unknown to me and alien in a country inexhaustibly rich. we wait," I think they cried. And it was as if their cry woke echo from the green-walled valleys of the mind into which I had strayed. Shall I confess that tears came into my eyes as I gazed hungrily around me on the harvest of their patience? Never was actuality so close to dream. It was not only an unknown country slipped in between these placid hills, on which I had chanced in my ramblings. I had entered for a few brief moments a strange region of consciousness. I was treading, thus accompanied, amid a world of welcoming and fearless life. Oh, friendly to me! The paths of man's imagination, the kingdom from which thought and curiosity vex scrutiny and lust, a lust it may be for nothing more impious than the actual, had prehistorically proven the insensate means of his banishment. Reality, consciousness, had he for the time being, unwittingly, unhappily missed his way? Would he be led back at length to that garden wherein cockatrice and basilisk bask, harmlessly at peace? I speculate now, in that queer, yes, and possibly sinister company, sinister only because it was alien to me. I did not speculate. In their garden the familiar was become the strange that lurks in the inmost heart, unburdens its riches in trance, flings its light and gilding upon love, gives heavenly savor to the intemperate bowl of passion, and is the secret of our incommunicable pity. What yet is queerer, these beings were evidently glad of my company. They stumped after me, as might yellow men after some occidental quadruped never before seen, in merry collusion of nods and wreathed smiles at this perhaps unprecedented intrusion. I stood for a moment looking out over the placid surface of the sea. A ship in sail hung phantom-like on the horizon. I pined to call my discovery to its seamen. The tide gushed, broke, spent itself on the bare boulders. I was suddenly cold and alone, and gladly turned back into the garden, my companions instinctively separating to let me pass between them. I breathed in the rare, almost exotic heat, the tenuous, honeyed, almond-laden air of its flowers and birds, gull, sheldrake, plover, wagtail, finch, robin, which as I half angrily, half sadly realized fluttered up in momentary dismay only at my presence, the embodied spectre of their enemy, man. Man? And who were these? I lost again a way lost early that morning, as I trudged inland at night. The dark came, warm and starry. I was dejected and exhausted beyond words. That night I slept in a barn and was awakened soon after daybreak by the crowing of cocks. I went out, dazed and blinking, into the sunlight, bathed face and hands in a brook near by, and came to a village before a soul was stirring. So I sat under a thrift-cushioned, thorn-crowned wall in a meadow, and once more drowsed off and fell asleep. When again I woke, it was 10 o'clock. The church clock in its tower knelled out the strokes, and I went into an inn for food. A corpulent blonde woman, kindly and hospitable, with a face comfortably resembling her own sow's, that yuffed and nosed in at the open door as I sat on my stool, served me with what I called for. I described, not without some vanishing shame, as if it were a treachery, my farm, its whereabouts. Her small blue eyes pigged at me with a fleeting expression which I failed to translate. The name of the farm, it appears, was Trevaris. "And did you see any of the creatures?" she asked me in a voice not entirely her own. The creatures? I sat back for an instant and stared at her, then realized that creature was the name of my host, and Maria and Christus, though here her dialect may have deceived me, the names of my two gardeners. She spun an absurd story, so far as I could tack it together and make it coherent. Superstitious stuff about this man who had wandered in upon the shocked and curious inhabitants of the district and made his home at Trevaris. A stranger and pilgrim, a foreigner, it seemed. A few words, dubious manners, and both uninformative. Then there was something. She placed her two fat hands, one of them wedding-ringed, on the zinc of the bar counter, and peered over at me, as if I were a delectable wash. Then there was something about a woman from the sea, in a blue gown, and either dumb, inarticulate, or mistress of only a foreign tongue. She must have lived in sin, moreover. Those pig's eyes seemed to yearn, since the children were simple, naturals, as God intends in such matters. It was useless. One's stomach may sometimes reject the cold, inactive, aerated water of the next morning, and my ridiculous intoxication had left me dry but not yet quite sober. Anyhow, this she told me, that my blue woman, as fair as flax, had died and was buried in the neighboring churchyard. the nearest to, though miles distant from, Trevaris. She repeatedly assured me, as I might otherwise doubt so sophisticated a fact, that I should find her grave there, her stone. So indeed I did, far away from the elect, and in a shape-ridden northwest corner of the sleepy cropless acre, a slab, scarcely rounded, of granite, with but a name bitten out of the dark rough surface, Femina Creature. End of section 14.
Section 15 of the Riddle and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Riddle and Other Stories by Walter de la Mare. The Riddle. So these 7 children, Anne and Matilda, James, William, and Henry, Harriet and Dorothea, came to live with their grandmother. The house in which their grandmother had lived since her childhood was built in the time of the Georges. It was not a pretty house, but roomy, substantial, and square, and an elm tree outstretched its branches almost to the windows. When the children were coming out of the cab, 5 sitting inside and 2 beside the driver, they were shown into their grandmother's presence. They stood in a little black group before the old lady, seated in her bow window, and she asked them each their names, and repeated each name in her kind, quavering voice. Then to one she gave a work-box, to William a jackknife, to Dorothea a painted ball, to each a present according to age, and she kissed all her grandchildren to the youngest. "My dears," she said, "I wish to see all of you bright and gay in my house. I am an old woman, so that I cannot romp with you, but Anne must look to you, and Mrs. Finn too. And every morning and every evening you must all come in to see your granny, and bring me smiling faces that call back to my mind my own son Harry. But all the rest of the day, when school is done, you shall do just as you please, my dears. And there is only one thing, just one, I would have you remember. In the large spare bedroom that looks out on the slate roof, there stands in the corner an old oak chest. Aye, older than I, my dears, a great deal older than my grandmother. Play anywhere else in the house, but not there." She spoke kindly to them all, smiling at them, but she was very aged, and her eyes seemed to see nothing of this world. And the 7 children, though at first they were gloomy and strange, soon began to be happy and at home in the great house. There was much to interest and to amuse them there. All was new to them. Twice every day, morning and evening, they came in to see their grandmother, who every day seemed more feeble, and she spoke pleasantly to them of her mother and her childhood, but never forgetting to visit her store of sugar plums, and so the weeks passed by. It was evening twilight when Henry went upstairs from the nursery by himself to look at the oak chest. He pressed his fingers into the carved fruit and flowers, and spoke to the dark smiling heads at the corners, and then, with a glance over his shoulder, he opened the lid and looked in. But the chest concealed no treasure, neither gold nor baubles, nor was there anything to alarm the eye. The chest was empty, except that it was lined with silk of old rose, seeming darker in the dusk, and smelling sweet of potpourri. And while Henry was looking in, he heard the softened laughter and the clinking of the cups downstairs in the nursery. And out at the window he saw the day darkening. These things brought strangely to his memory his mother, who in her glimmering white dress used to read to him in the dusk. And he climbed into the chest, and the lid closed gently down over him. When the other 6 children were tired with their playing, they filed into their grandmother's room as usual for her good night and her sugar plums. She looked out between the candles at them as if she were unsure of something in her thoughts. The next day Anne told her grandmother that Henry was not anywhere to be found. "Dearie me, child, then he must be gone away for a time," said the old lady. She paused. "But remember, all of you, do not meddle with the oak chest." But Matilda could not forget her brother Henry, finding no pleasure in playing without him. So she would loiter in the house thinking where he might be, and she carried her wood doll in her bare arms, singing under her breath all she could make up about him. And when, in a bright morning, she peeped in on the chest, so sweet-scented and secret, It seemed that she took her doll with her into it, just as Henry himself had done. So Anne and James and William, Harriet and Dorothea were left at home to play together. "Some day maybe they will come back to you, my dears," said their grandmother, "or maybe you will go to them. Heed my warning as best you may." Now Harriet and William were friends together, pretending to be sweethearts, while James and Dorothea liked wild games of hunting and fishing and battles. On a silent afternoon in October, Harriet and William were talking softly together, looking out over the slate roof at the green fields, and they heard the squeak and frisking of a mouse behind them in the room. They went together and searched for the small dark hole from whence it had come out, but finding no hole, they began to finger the carving of the chest, and to give names to the dark smiling heads, just as Henry had done. "I know. Let's pretend you are Sleeping Beauty, Harriet," said William, "and I'll be the prince that squeezes through the thorns and comes in." Harriet looked gently and strangely at her brother, but she got into the box and lay down, pretending to be fast asleep. And on tiptoe William leaned over, and seeing how big was the chest, he stepped in to kiss the Sleeping Beauty and to wake her from her quiet sleep. Slowly the carved lid turned on its noiseless hinges, and only the clatter of James and Dorothea came in sometimes to recall Anne from her book. But their grandmother was very feeble, and her sight dim, and her hearing extremely difficult. Snow was falling through the still air upon the roof, and Dorothea was a fish in the oak chest, and James stood over the hole in the ice, brandishing a walking stick for a harpoon, pretending to be an Eskimo. Dorothea's face was red, and her wild eyes sparkled through her tousled hair, and James had a crooked scratch upon his cheek. "You must struggle, Dorothea, and then I shall swim back and drag you out. Be quick now," he shouted with laughter as he was drawn into the open chest, and the lid closed softly and gently down as before. Anne, left to herself, was too old to care over much for sugar plums, but she would go solitary to bid her grandmother good night, and the old lady looked wistfully at her over her spectacles. "Well, my dear," she said with her trembling head, and she squeezed Anne's fingers between her own knuckled finger and thumb. "What lonely old people we are, to be sure." Anne kissed her grandmother's soft, loose cheek. She left the old lady sitting in her easy chair, her hands upon her knees, and her head turned sidelong towards her. When Anne was gone to bed, she used to sit reading her book by candlelight. She drew up her knees under the sheets, resting her book upon them. Her story was about fairies and gnomes, and the gently flowing moonlight of the narrative seemed to illumine the white pages. And she could hear in fancy fairy voices, so silent was the great many-roomed house, and so mellifluent were the words of the story. Presently she put out her candle, and with a confused babble of voices close to her ear, and faint, swift pictures before her eyes, she fell asleep. And in the dead of night she arose out of bed and dream, and with eyes wide open, yet seeing nothing of reality, moved silently through the vacant house, past the room where her grandmother was snoring in brief, heavy slumber. She stepped lightly and surely, and down the wide staircase. And Vega, the far shining, stood over the window above the slate roof. Anne walked in the strange room as if she were being guided by the hand towards the oak chest. There, just as if she was dreaming it was her bed, she laid herself down in the old rose silk in the fragrant place. But it was so dark in the room that the movement of the lid was indistinguishable. Through the long day the grandmother sat in her bow window. Her lips were pursed, and she looked with dim, inquisitive scrutiny upon the street, where people passed to and fro, and vehicles rolled by. At evening she climbed the stair and stood in the doorway of the large spare bedroom. The ascent had shortened her breath. Her magnifying spectacles rested upon her nose. Leaning her hand on the doorpost, she peered in towards the glimmering square of window in the quiet gloom. But she could not see far, because her sight was dim, and the light of day feeble. Nor could she detect the faint fragrance, as of autumnal leaves, but in her mind was a tangled skein of memories, laughter and tears, and little children now old-fashioned, and the advent of friends and long farewells. And gossiping fitfully, inarticulately with herself, the old lady went down again to her window-seat. End of section 15.
Section 16 of the Riddle and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Timbre Schaefer. The Riddle and Other Stories by Walter de la Mare. The Vats. Many years ago now, in that once upon a time which is the memory of the imagination rather than of the workaday mind, I went walking with a friend. Of what passed before we set out, I have nothing but the vaguest recollection. All I remember is that it was early morning, that we were happy to be in one another's company, that there were bright green boughs overhead, amongst which the birds floated and sang, and that the early dews still burned in their crystal in the sun. We were taking our way, almost at haphazard, across country. There was now grass, now the faintly sparkling, flinty dust of an English road underfoot. With remarkably few humans to be seen, we trudged on, turning our eyes ever and again to glance laughingly, questioningly, or perplexedly at one another's, then slanting them once more on the blue canopied countryside. It was spring, in the month of May, I think, and we were talking of time. We speculated on what it was, and where it went to, touched in furtive tones on the fourth dimension, and exchanged the magic formula. We wondered if pigs could see time as they see the wind, and wished we could recline a while upon those bewitching banks where it grows wild. We confessed to each other how of late we had been pining in our secret hearts for just a brief spell of an eternity of it. Time wherein we could be and think and dream all that each busy, hugger-mugger, feverish, precipitate 24 hours would not allow us to be or to think or dream. Impracticable, infatuate desire. We desired to muse, to brood, to meditate, to embark with a buoyant cargo upon that quiet stream men call reverie. We had all but forgotten how even to sleep. We lay like Argus of nights, with all our 100 eyes ajar. There were books we should never now be able to read, speculations we should never be able to explore, riddles we should never so much as hear put, much less expounded. There were, above all, waking visions now past hoping for, long since shut away from us by the stream of the hasty moments, as they tick and silt and slide irrecoverably away. In the gay folly of that bright morning, we could almost have vowed there were even other selves awaiting us, with whom no kind of precarious tryst we had ever been faithful to. Perhaps they and we would be ready if only the world's mechanical clocks would cease their trivial moralizings. And memories, surely they would come arrowing home in the first of the evening to haunts serene and unmolested, if only the weather and mood and season and housing we could offer were decently propitious. We had frittered away, squandered so many days, weeks, years, and had saved so little. Spendthrifts of the unborrowable, we had been living on our capital, a capital bringing in how meager an interest, and were continually growing poorer. Once, when we were children, and in our own world, an hour had been as capacious as the blue bowl of the sky, and of as refreshing a milk. Now its successors haggardly snatched their way past our sluggard senses, like thieves pursued, like an hourglass that cannot tell the difference between its head and its heels, like a dial on a sunless day, like a timepiece wound up and bereft of its pendulum. So were we. Age, we had hideously learned, devours life as a river consumes flakes of the falling snow. Soon we should be beggars, with scarcely a month to our name, and none to give us alms. I confess that at this crisis in our talk I caught an uncomfortable glimpse of the visionary stallions of my hearse, ink-black streaming manes and tails, positively galloping me off, wreaths, glass, corpse, and all, to keep their dismal appointment with the grave, and even at that, abominably late. Indeed, our minds had at length become so profoundly engaged in these pictures and forebodings as we paced on, that a complete aeon might have meanwhile swept over our heads. We had talked ourselves into a kind of oblivion, nor had either of us given the least thought to our direction or destination. We had been following not even so much as our noses, and then suddenly we came to. Maybe it was the unwanted silence, a silence unbroken even by the harp-like drone of noonday, that recalled us to ourselves. Maybe the air in these unfamiliar parts was of a crisper quality, or the mere effect of the strangeness around us had muttered in secret to our inward spirits. Whether or not, we both of us discovered at the same instant, and as if at a signal, that without being aware of it, and while still our tongues were wagging on together on our old-fashioned theme, we had come into sight of the Vats. We looked up, and lo, they lay there in the middle distance, in cluster enormous under the cloudless sky, and here were we. Imagine 2 age-scarred wolf-skinned humans of prehistoric days paddling along at shut of evening on some barbarous errand, and suddenly from a sweeping crest on Salisbury Plain, descrying on the nearer horizon the awful monoliths of Stonehenge. An experience resembling that was ours this summer day. We came at once to a standstill amid the far-flung stretches of the unknown plateau on which we had re-found ourselves, and with eyes fixed upon these astonishing objects, stood and stared. I have called them vats. Vats they were not, but rather sunken reservoirs, vast semi-spherical primeval cisterns of an area many times that of the bloated and swollen gasometers which float like huge flattened bubbles between earth and heaven under the sunlit clouds of the Thames. But no sunbeams dispread themselves here. They lay slumbering in a grave crystal light, which lapped deep as the Tuscarora trough, above and around their prodigious stone plates or slats or slabs or laminae, their steep slopes washed by the rarefied atmosphere of their site, and in hue of a hoary green. As we gazed at them like this from afar, they seemed to be in number, as I remember, about 9, but they were by no means all of a size. For 1 or 2 of the rotundas were smaller in compass than the others, just as there may be big snails or mushrooms in a family and little ones. But any object on earth of a majesty or magnitude that recalls the pyramids is a formidable spectacle. And not a word passed between us, scarcely a glance, as with extreme caution and circumspection we approached, creeping human pace by pace, to view them nearer. A fit of shivering came over me, I recollect, as thus advantaged I scanned their enormous sides, shaggy with tufts of a monstrous moss, and scarred with yard-wide circumambulations of lichen. Gigantic grasses stooped their fatted seed pods from the least rough ledge. They might be walls of ice, so cold their aspect, or of a matter discoverable only in an alien planet. Not, though they were horrific to the eye, not that they were in themselves appalling to the soul. Far rather they seemed to be emblems of an ineffable peace, harmless as, centuries before Noah, were the playing leviathans in a then privy Pacific. And when one looked close on them, it was to see myriads of animated infinitesimals in crevice and cranny, of a beauty, hue, and symmetry past eye to seize. Indeed, there was a hint remotely human in the looks of these vats. The likeness between them resembled that between generations of mankind, countless generations old. Contemplating them with the unparalleled equanimity their presence at last bestowed, one might almost have ventured to guess their names. And never have I seen sward or turf so smooth and virginally emerald as that which heaved itself against their Brobdingnagian flanks. My friend and I, naturally enough, were acutely conscious of our minuteness of stature as we stood side by side in this unrecorded solitude, and, out of our little round heads, peered up at them with our eyes. Obviously, their muscus incrustations and the families of weeds flourishing in their interstices were of an age to daunt the imagination. Their ancestry must have rooted itself here when the dinosaur and the tribes of the megatherium roamed Earth's crust, and the pterodactyl clashed through its twilight, thousands of centuries before the green acorn sprouted that was to afford little Cain in a fallen world his first leafy petticoats. I realized, as if at a sigh, why smiles the Sphinx, why the primary stars have blazed on in undiminishing midnight luster during man's brief history, and his childish constellations have scarcely by a single inch of heaven changed in their apparent stations. They wore that air of lovely timelessness which decks the thorn, and haunts for the half-woken sense the odor of sweet briar. Yet they were gray with the everlasting, as are the beards of the patriarchs and the cindery craters of the moon. Theirs was the semblance of having been lost, forgotten, abandoned, like some foundered, nereid-haunted derelict of the first sailors, rotting in dream upon an undiscovered shore. They hunched their vast shapes out of the green beneath the sunless blue of space, and for untrodden leagues around them stretched, like a paradisal savanna, what we poor thronging clock-vexed men call silence, solitude. In telling of these vats, it is difficult to convey in mere words even a fraction of their effect upon our minds. And not merely our minds. They called to some hidden being within us that, if not their coeval, was at least aware of their exquisite antiquity. Whether of archangelic or demonic construction, clearly they had remained unvisited by mortal man for as many centuries at least as there are cherries in Damascus or beads in Tierra del Fuego. Sharers of this thought, we two dwarf visitors had whispered an instant or so together, face to face, and then were again mute. Yes, we were of one mind about that. In the utmost depths of our imaginations, it was clear to us that these supremely solitary objects, if not positively cast out of thought, had been abandoned. But by whom? My friend and I had sometimes talked of the divine abandoner, and also, if one can and may, distinguish between mood and person, between the dream and the dreamer of it. Here was the vacancy of his presence, just as one may be aware of a filament of his miracle in the smiling beauty that hovers above the swaying grasses of an indecipherable gravestone. Looking back on the heatless and rayless noonday of those vats, I see, as I have said, the mere bodies of my friend and me, the upright bones of us, indescribably dwarfed by their antediluvian monstrosity. Yet within the lightless bellies of these sarcophagi were heaped up, we were utterly assured, though how I know not, floods beyond measure of the waters for which our souls had pined. Waters imaginably so clear as to be dense, as if of melted metal, more translucent even than crystal, of such a tenuous purity that not even the moonlit branches of a dream would spell their reflex in them. So costly, so far beyond price, that this whole stony world's rubies and sapphires and amethysts of Mandalay and Guadalajara and Solikamsk, all the treasure houses of Cambaluc and the booty of King Tamburlaine would suffice to purchase not one drop. It is indeed the unseen, the imagined, the untold of, the fabulous, the forgotten, that alone lies safe from mortal moth and rust. And these vats, their very silence held us spellbound, as were the isles before the sirens sang. But how, it may be asked? No sound? No spectral tread? No faintest summons, and not the minutest iota of a superscription? None. I sunk my very being into nothingness, so that I seemed to become but a shell receptive of the least of whispers. But the multitudinous life that was here was utterly silent. No sigh, no ripple, no pining chime of rilling drop within. Waters of life, but infinitely still. I may seem to have used extravagant terms. My friend and I used none. We merely stood in dumb survey of these crusted, butt-like domes of stone, wherein slept elixir vitae, whose last echo had been the corregium of the morning stars. God knows there are potent explosives in these latter days. My friend and I had merely the nails upon our fingers, a penknife and a broken pair of scissors in our pockets. We might have scraped 77 score growths of a Nebuchadnezzar's talons down to the quick, and yet have left all but unmarked and unscarred those mossed and monstrous laminae. But we had tasted the untastable, and were refreshed in spirit at least a little more endurably than are the camel riders of the Sahara, dream-ridden by mirage. We knew now and forever that time pure is, that here, somewhere awaiting us and all forlorn mankind, lay hid the solace of our mortal longing, that doubtless the seraph, whose charge is the living waters, will, in the divine hour, fetch down his iron key in his arms, and, well, Dives, rich man and crumb waster that he was, pleaded out of the flames for but one drop of them. Neither my friend nor I was a Dives then, nor was ever likely to be. And now only I remain. We were children of Lazarus, aging, footsore, dusty, and athirst. We smiled openly, and with an extraordinary gentle felicity at one another, his eyes and mine, as we turned away from the Vats. End of section 16. End of The Riddle and Other Stories by Walter de la Mare.